welcome to the concurrent sessions here this afternoon. My name is Brandon Williamson, and I'll be the moderator for the next three speakers. So just want to mention, I want to thank the gold sponsors, City of Toronto. Silver sponsors will be the Invasive Species Center, Elutioners Vegetation Management, and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, as well as CPRO.
I need to move you over.
BASF and Corteva Agriscience as our bronze sponsors. So fantastic. So the first session here at 1 o'clock is an update on the Hydrilla in Ontario. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rebecca Rooney with the University of Waterloo. And Dr. Rebecca Rooney is the founder and director of the Waterloo Wetland Lab, a wetland ecology research group at the University of Waterloo. Rebecca teaches students in ecology and conservation biology, and her graduate students conduct research into ecological integrity and wetland responses to human disturbance. She has studied topics from wetland reclamation and restoration, invasive plant management, species at risk recovery, and the fate and effects of contaminants like pesticides, microplastics, and hydrocarbons. So with that, Dr. Rooney, take it away. And I'll give you about a 3-minute warning.
Oh, thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen here.
We can see it right now. It's just not in presenter mode.
Try that again.
Done. Looks good. Thank you.
How's that?
Yep.
Awesome.
Looks good.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming back. And today I'll be giving you an update on the status and the treatment of the Hydrilla invasion, which we detected this summer. So I wanted to start by telling you a bit about Hydrilla and how to recognize it. So Hydrilla is an invasive plant that was well established in the US, but until now has not been seen in Canada. It's listed as prohibited under Ontario's Invasive Species Act, meaning it's illegal to possess, transport, or grow it. It's a wetland plant with a submersed aquatic growth form, quite similar in appearance to Elodea, Canada waterweed, and also Najas flexilis, nodding water nymph. So you see in the photo in the center here, you've got Hydrilla on the left, Elodea on the right. And the main way to tell them apart is that Elodea has leaf margins that are smooth, and there's usually 3 leaves in a whorl, versus Hydrilla can have anywhere from 3 to 8 leaves in a whorl, even as much as 10 leaves in a whorl. But the leaves have toothed margins. So in the photo on the right, that's a little bit more zoomed in, you can see little saw-edge teeth on the edge of the leaves, as well as the mid-vein has sharp prickles. It also has tubers, which Elodea does not, and we'll talk a bit more about the tubers soon. But there are a variety of online resources supplied now by the Invasive Species Center, the Ontario MNR, and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters at their invadingspecies.com website. So I encourage you to check out those different resources and get familiar with Hydrilla. As we know, looking like one of our native plants doesn't mean that a species will behave like our native plants and play well with others. Hydrilla is capable of very rapid growth, reaching lengths of branching stems extending over 7 meters that can tangle together to form dense mats. And these mats can clog intakes, impact recreational value of the water. If you look at this photo on the right we took where we found Hydrilla last summer, it's so thick, it almost looks as though you could walk across it, but this water is actually about 2 meters deep. And so you can imagine trying to fish, trying to boat, trying to swim through this water. It limits the flow of the water, which also impacts water quality. So it can increase water temperature and pH and reduce oxygen availability. And the dense mats, the impaired water quality, unsurprisingly affect native wildlife, reduces fish habitat quality, and can outcompete native plants. So there's a biodiversity concern to Hydrilla as well. The main reason to be alarmed is because it spreads so easily and because it's so difficult to eradicate once it has spread. It's actually so easy to spread that some have dubbed it North America's most invasive weed. It has 4 mechanisms that it can spread through. First, seeds, which form from small white flowers that float above the water's surface. And second, from fragmentation. So actually the name Hydrilla is after the Greek monster, the Hydra, as it can grow an entirely new plant from as little as a 1-inch fragment. The nodes of the parent plant break away into these buoyant fragments that disperse through the water. Fragmentation occurs naturally because of wave action, but anthropogenic activities like boating can increase fragmentation. It produces turions, which are these small, compact, dormant buds that are a bit like pine cones, and they form them on branches attached to the stem axils. These fall off when they're mature and then float away on water currents or settle to the sediment to grow new plants. And the tubers, which I mentioned. So these are larger. They're about a centimeter in length, and they're sort of potato-like. They form attached to the rhizomes in the sediment. And these can be viable for up to 10 years. This allows hydrilla to regrow from the tuber bank, even if you've gone in and killed all the above ground parts of the plant. Once the tuber bank becomes established, it becomes a long slog to try to eradicate hydrilla from a lake or a wetland, just because these tubers can live for so long, they build up in what we call the tuber bank. And this is why early detection and rapid response is especially important with hydrilla. How did it get here? Hydrilla is native to Australia, Africa, and parts of Asia, and we believe that it first colonized North America from an aquarium release in Florida in the 1950s. But to understand the invasion dynamics of hydrilla, it's important to know we are dealing with more than one biotype in North America. The first introduction that occurred in Florida was of the dioecious biotype, so that means that the male and the female flowers occur on different plants. Then in 1976, a second introduction took place in Delaware, and this was with the monoecious biotype. So the male and female flowers occur on the same plant. And the monoecious strain is capable of surviving further north than the dioecious strain. It's also thought to produce more tubers and turions compared to the dioecious strain. Although the monoecious hydrilla had spread to both Niagara and Erie counties in New York, it had never been confirmed in Canada until the 30th of June last summer, while my research lab was out conducting some baseline vegetation monitoring in Hillman Marsh in Essex Region. So this is the location of Hillman Marsh near Leamington, Ontario, just north of Point Pelee National Park. It is a multi-use marsh. It's owned by the Essex Region Conservation Authority. Caldwell First Nation are an important rights holder on the property, and it's currently managed for a variety of outdoor education and recreational activities, including bird banding, waterfowl hunting. It has two diked, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but these two diked cells, the west cell and the east cell, which are hydrologically separated from Lake Erie proper. They're managed for waterfowl hunting and for shorebirds. In 2019, the barrier beach that separated this kind of 115-hectare area of open water from Lake Erie was breached. And you can see this is a more recent image. It's directly connected now to Lake Erie. And this resulted in a reduction in water quality and biodiversity, and these effects are being addressed in the Hillman Marsh Restoration Plan. So we, the Waterloo Wetland Lab, were out doing some baseline vegetation monitoring around that planned restoration. And we detected what looked like hydrilla here in the western cell. So you can see a photo we took of hydrilla where we saw it growing with Elodea, and that was along the side of the dike on the western cell here. So I want to take a little time to walk through what happened next, because I think it's a really great example of when everything worked. And it worked because all the right partners were engaged in a collective action model. So we first detected what we thought might be hydrilla on June 30th. And within a couple of days, we had notified MNR, and they had engaged the response framework for new invasive species, which an earlier talk today was introducing us all to. By July 3rd, they had a voucher specimen in hand, and then just a couple weeks later, those had been analyzed by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and confirmed that it was hydrilla and it was the monoecious biotype. This then triggered notification of the Ontario Critical Plant Pest Management Committee, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as the Great Lakes Governors and Premiers Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force. So within a month of the first detection, a hydrilla response team was formed, co-chaired by the property owners, IRCA, and the MNR staff, and it included members from Caldwell First Nation, the Canadian Wildlife Service, the Ontario Invasive Plant Centre, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, Parks Canada, and us at the University of Waterloo. The response team also had access to guidance from Michigan, New York, Ohio, and Iowa state environment agencies who all had more experience dealing with hydrilla. The response team led a coordinated communication strategy. We posted signs, did a media release to notify the public and remind everyone how important it is to clean, drain, and dry. We also conducted a joint surveillance operation with partnership from 6 different agencies, including Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, who provided equipment and guidance on appropriate decontamination for hydrilla. And I'll talk a little more about decontamination protocols later in this talk, but let me tell you, I have worked with invasive plants for over a decade, and reading their decontamination guidance was quite eye-opening. So at the end of July, the joint surveillance operation sampled over 150 survey plots. These are the orange dots in the picture here. And they found, much to everyone's relief, that hydrilla seemed isolated to that 40-hectare western cell where we first found it. It had not spread up into the Hillman or Lebo creeks or into the shorebird cell, which receives water pumped into it from the infested west cell. Also, IRCA took the precaution of shutting down access to the west cell of the marsh and closing the controlled waterfowl hunt to prevent potential spread. So by September, permitting and procurement was underway with CPRO to support herbicide treatment of the hydrilla. And in October, we went back to conduct pre-treatment monitoring before the first herbicide application took place on October 17th. So from first detection to treatment within 4 months, I think is really quite a feat, and is really representative of the kind of coordinated cross-agency partnerships that we need to effectively tackle new invasive species. I want to pause for a moment to recognize all the agencies and individuals who participated in the surveillance. And honestly, I'm sure I'm missing names here, but it was a really concerted effort with broad partnership. During the joint surveillance operation, nobody actually went into the west cell to assess how extensive or intensive the infestation of hydrilla was because of serious concerns about decontamination. So we didn't really know how much hydrilla there was. The cell itself is about 40 hectares in area, and we kind of hoped, maybe it was just confined to the margins of that cell. To determine how extensive and intensive the infestation was, we were contracted to do a baseline survey. We used a standard grid survey design to help us systematically sample the open water. This would tell us about the extent of the above ground vegetation. And then in addition, we took sediment cores, and this allowed us to assess the state of the tuber bank. Remember, the tubers can live for up to 10 years, and the monoecious biotype that we're dealing with makes more tubers. So the older the infestation, the more the tuber bank will have built up. The more the tuber bank has built up, the harder it will be to actually eradicate hydrilla, and the greater the risk that it could spread before it is eradicated. Last, we wanted to know what other plants were growing with hydrilla to see what kind of impact the invasion was having on the plant community. Reducing invasive plants and restoring a healthy vegetation community is one of the main objectives of the Hillman Marsh Restoration Plan. So this knowledge is really important if we want to understand how successful the restoration efforts are. So in early October 2024, we sampled 60 different target sampling points, and at each point we measured the percent cover of floating vegetation, the percent infestation of all species of submersed aquatic vegetation, as well as the relative biovolume of the different species. And we took these sediment samples to look at the tuber bank that were 20 centimeters deep at least. And what we found was that hydrilla was detected in nearly every part of the western cell. So unfortunately, it wasn't just restricted to the area around the perimeter. It was present in 37 of the 60 plots, and 4 of the plots had a total infestation percentage over 70%. So this means, like you can see in these photos, it is almost completely full of hydrilla, and there's no other plants growing with it. Other plants that we found growing in the western cell where there was lower biovolumes of hydrilla included coontail, duckweed, and Canada waterweed. But a lot of the places where it was growing densely, there wasn't very much else growing with it. Our monitoring really underscored another key element of success of the plan, and that was we identified where the locations of these red boxes are in the map are where there are duck blinds that are part of the controlled waterfowl hunt. So it turns out that it was really important that IRCA took the step of closing the waterfowl hunt and closing access to these blinds. because even the most fastidious hunters could have unintentionally picked up tubers or turians. There's a reason why the Michigan decontamination protocols recommend power washing with hot water or bleaching all the gear that comes into contact with hydrilla infested water. So it's more than just clean, drain, and dry that's needed. So it was lucky that was one of the immediate actions taken. So that's kind of the bad news, but we also have good news, and that comes from the tuber bank. So the best practices coming out of US hydrilla monitoring emphasize how important sediment monitoring is. Because of the persistence of the tubers, it tells us how old the infestation is likely, as well as how long the fight to eradicate it is likely to take. And while sampling, we observed turians and tubers both on actively growing hydrilla plants at most of the locations where we saw hydrilla, but the key is how many have accumulated in the sediment. In the US, they're commonly reporting as many as 1,000 to 9,000 tubers per meter squared. So the good news is we did not find much of a tuber bank. We only found mature tubers, which are kind of on the left-hand photo, the upper photo there, at 2 of the 60 sites, and then immature, potentially non-viable tubers at another 5 stations. And even at the highest density station, we only saw 760 tubers per meter squared compared to that 1,000 to 9,000 that's reported from the US. So we were pretty confident that the tuber bank is not as established as we'd feared. And we communicated with Dr. Ben Sperry, who's an expert from the US Army Corps of Engineers and at the University of Florida, sending him vouchers photos to kind of confirm these tubers and which ones were likely viable or non-viable. So this tells us 3 things. Likely we caught the invasion quite early because there's not a big tuber bank. Also, it paints an optimistic picture about how long treatment will need to proceed for, because there isn't this huge tuber bank that's going to be repopulating the invasion after every treatment. But it's, on the other hand, kind of alarming because it shows just how rapidly hydrilla took over this west cell.
Sorry, Dr. Rooney, about 3 minutes.
Sure. So in the US, where they've had 75 years of experience managing hydrilla, they've used a combination of water drawdowns, mechanical removal, even releasing sterile grass carp to eat it. But the main approach for controlling hydrilla is herbicide. They have access to different products than we do here in Canada. The product approved for application to control hydrilla here is ProcellaCOR FX, produced by CPRO. And I know that John Goslin is going to be speaking from CPRO later, so I won't tell you a ton about this product, but it is an auxin mimic, so it acts as a growth regulating herbicide, and it is selective. So it has more activity on broadleaf and dicot species, but it does have good activity on fast growing hydrilla. It spares common emergent plants like cattail and bulrush. So there's some kind of selectivity, which is, I think, a good thing. So on October 17th, Solitude Lake Management were contracted by IRCA to apply ProcellaCOR FX to the west cell. They applied 960 prescription dose units, which achieved about a 21 part per billion concentration of the active ingredient florpyrauxifen-benzyl in the water. This is the tracks that their boat took. So we're keen to see what effect this treatment had. Next up for us, we're hoping to continue monitoring the extent of the infestation, its intensity, and the tuber bank to assess treatment efficacy. We're also interested in what the effect of the hydrilla invasion has been on the invertebrates and the plants in the wetland, the response of the plant community to the hydrilla treatment, and just a broader survey for possible locations where hydrilla may occur outside of this area. And whether things like remote sensing can be used to help with that survey effort. I did want to talk about the decontamination process. We rinsed our gear daily with clean water on site and then packed it up in secure action packers when we were kind of leaving it overnight. But at the end of our field work, we rinsed everything into the source water, then washed it in a 5.25% bleach solution to kill the turians and the tubers. We then rinsed it again and dried it for 15 days in a secure location. The sediment that we collected, we needed permits to be able to transport because we knew it had turions and tubers in it. We washed that down a sink that had a sediment trap so it didn't go into the wastewater. And then we emptied and dried that sediment at 90 degrees for 48 hours or longer, the same way that we did any of the tubers or plant fragments that we collected from those samples. And then once they'd been dried, they were disposed of in a landfill. You guys all know this already, but I think this is the message that we need to get out into the public is, how do you recognize hydrilla, be on alert for it, use these resources that have been produced, and then make sure that it's being reported either in EdMaps or iNaturalist or over the Invasive Species Awareness hotline. So I will take questions. I think there's still a couple of minutes for questions, but I want to leave this acknowledgement slide up while I do that because I think all of these partners deserve a lot of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Rooney. I really appreciate that. What a fantastic presentation. There's no questions in the Q&A right now, but if you do want to check that shortly, then maybe you can answer some if they come in. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Sounds
great. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Great, so we're going to move on to the next presentation, and that is oak wilt, an emerging threat to Ontario's forests. And the speaker today, I'd like to introduce Julie Holmes, plant health and survey biologist with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Julie joined the CFIA after completing a BSc in ecology at the University of Guelph, where she became passionate about invasive species biology. Since joining the agency as an inspector in 2006, Julie has held a variety of positions within CFIA's operations, science, and policy and programs branches to support delivery of the plant health program. As a plant health survey biologist for Ontario, Julie works on a number of high visibility pest files and enjoys many opportunities for collaboration with partners and stakeholders who share in the goal of protecting Canada's ecosystems from invasive species. Oak wilt is a destructive pest regulated under the authority of the Plant Protection Act, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency conducts surveys, develops outreach and education products to promote plant health issues, and establishes partnerships to support the regulatory control and collective response to critical plant pests. So, Julie, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Brandon. I appreciate that. Good afternoon. As Brandon mentioned, my name is Julie Holmes, and I work for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as the Ontario Plant Health Survey Biologist. And I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to present today, as oak wilt is certainly one of several pests on Ontario's doorstep. And one could even argue that it's already walked in through the front door, which we'll get to in a bit. But the greater the awareness of this pest, the better chances we have in detecting it early and facilitating a rapid and active response to safeguard our resources, our oak resources in Ontario. So during my talk today, I'll introduce you to oak wilt and familiarize you with its signs and symptoms. In keeping with the theme of this year's conference, we'll talk about the leading edge of the pest and go over some of the successes we've seen following the detections of oak wilt in Ontario, with emphasis placed on the importance of partnerships, outreach, and education. So oak wilt is a vascular disease, which is caused by the fungus Verticillata phagocerum. Once a tree becomes infected with the fungus, the onset of symptoms is fairly quick and typically followed by mortality of the tree. This pest was first documented in the state of Wisconsin in 1942, but it's likely been present in the US since the early 1900s. So it's currently found within 24 states, covering much of the eastern US. And despite its longstanding presence there, we're still learning a lot about this disease, and its origins remain unknown. So all species of oak are considered susceptible to oak wilt. One main distinction that I will make is that oaks falling in the red oak group, so your red, black, pin, and shoe-marred oaks are more susceptible to infection. So the disease is capable of killing the tree within as little as 2 weeks, but more typically within a single season. Oaks within the white oak group, so your white, bur, and chinkapin oaks, are still susceptible, but due to differences in their vascular structure, they're less likely to die from the disease and may take many years in order to decline. We'll quickly go over the disease cycle of this pest, which looks complicated, but it's really not. Just follow along here. Once the fungal spores have been introduced into the system, the fungus develops on the outer sapwood of the tree, causing the host to develop tyloses and gums. So this restricts the flow of nutrients and water in the affected tissues. These symptoms will start to develop, and the tree effectively starts to wilt, which is where the common name oak wilt comes from. The disease will progress and eventually lead to the death of the tree. So once the tree is dead, it can produce spore-bearing mats which form underneath the bark. So as they mature, they start to exert an outward pressure on the bark. Also why they're sometimes referred to as pressure pads, which causes longitudinal cracking and opens up the tree. So there are two ways that the disease can then transfer this to a new host, overland spread and root graft spread. So overland spread involves nididulid and oak bark beetles, which are attracted to the fruity smell of those fungal mats, as well as the volatile chemicals from the wounded tree. They feed on those pressure pads and then can transfer those sticky spores to fresh wounds of healthy trees and start new infection centers. So this method of spread accounts for localized spread over longer distances as compared to root graft spreading. So root graft spread takes place underground between the root systems. So the roots of infected trees will graft with roots of nearby healthy trees and then transfer the fungus. So once introduced into a new area, root grafting typically accounts for the majority of local spread. So this is why you can often see pockets of infestation stemming from an infected tree. With root grafting, infection spreads at shorter distances, which is limited to the root graft zone of the tree. So in addition to natural spread, there's also the human-mediated component to consider. So pruning, construction, or other activities that cause wounds to the tree on healthy trees leave them susceptible to introduction of the fungus from visiting insect vectors, which could be carrying fungal spores. So conducting these activities between the beginning of April to the end of October, when insect vectors could possibly be active, can increase the potential for local spread. For this reason, we advise against pruning oak trees outside of that low-risk window. The movement of wood products, such as firewood and logs, can account for long-distance dispersal for the pest as well. So this is especially true for material that has bark attached to it, which may contain fungal mats, which could then be attractive to insect vectors. So symptoms typically develop beginning in May and continue throughout the growing season. So with leaf discoloration, you'll see individual leaves turn progressively bronze. So this color change will move inward out from the leaf margins, starting at the tip of the leaf and progressing towards the midrib and down to the petiole. The border between the healthy and discolored tissue will be very distinct and sharp, as you can see in the photo there. And you might even see small clusters of discolored and drooping leaves, which give the appearance of a flag up in the canopy. So vascular staining may also be present, and these dark rings can be seen in the cross sections of infected branches. The tree will also exhibit top-down leaf wilting or bronzing of the foliage, which you can see in the photo in the center of the slide. This starts at the top of the crown and tips of the branches before rapidly spreading throughout the entire tree. Premature leaf drop also begins at the crown of the tree. Leaves are cast rapidly as the infection progresses, and it's not uncommon for infected trees to be almost entirely defoliated within a few weeks of symptom onset. So this is one of the characteristic features of oak wilt, as other abiotic conditions and diseases such as frost damage, leaf spot diseases, bacterial scorch, or nutrient deficiencies are unlikely to cause complete defoliation in this manner. And you can also see on to the right, longitudinal bark cracks, which may be present. Those again form along the bole over top of the fungal mats. I'll also just take a moment here to note that these symptoms are characteristic of red oaks, as white oaks die more slowly, one branch at a time, over a period of 1 to potentially many years. Symptoms usually progress much more slowly in white oaks, which typically don't produce those fungal mats. So on the left, you can see the vertical bark crack in the image with a fresh pad, pressure pad to the right. The fungal mats typically appear as a mixture of white, gray, and black. And when they're really fresh, I think there's almost a greenish tinge to them, which you can see in my photo here. It's really important to note that spore mats can form only after the tree has died. They sometimes occur in autumn of the year that the tree dies, but more commonly it's in the spring the following year. So one thing to remember when you're out in the field is that if the tree is still out in leaf, you won't see those pressure pads or bark cracks forming as a result of oak wilt. Also to note, the fungal mats emit a fruity smell that people often compare to juicy fruit gum. So I definitely see the comparison. I think it smells a little bit closer to apple cider vinegar, but again, you can definitely see why they say juicy fruit gum when you do smell it. So oaks are a prominent component of both forest and urban landscapes within Canada. So the establishment of oak wilt could have devastating impacts on this resource. Oaks offer us a number of social and ecological services, and they're also culturally valuable. Not only are they commercially valuable as a forest commodity, but they're often a staple in parks, residential properties, and woodlots. It's estimated that there are over 180 million oak trees in eastern Canada. So if the disease were to establish, management could place a significant economic strain on land managers and homeowners. So again, in keeping with the theme of the conference this year, talking about the leading edge, while oak wilt is generally present across the eastern US, in looking at the states directly bordering southern Ontario, we're certainly in the line of fire, so to speak. So there are records dating back to the 1950s within the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, where oak wilt is fairly well established. In 2008, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation reported its first detection. So finds have been isolated to smaller trees, and it's not considered widespread there, with the closest population to Ontario located in the Finger Lakes region. So in 2016, a population was identified on Belle Isle in Michigan, which basically sits in the middle of the Detroit River, around 600 meters from the city of Windsor, Ontario. So pretty close. And in 2023, we had our very first detection, first Canadian record of oak wilt in southern Ontario. So taking into account the recent detections in New York, the pest pressure in Michigan, and the presence of oak wilt in Ontario, you can certainly see that we're on the leading edge of the invasion here in Ontario. So as I mentioned in my previous slide, we found oak wilt in 2023 within Canada. In Ontario, there were a total of 3 isolated populations that were detected in the span of about a month. And these were located in the city of Niagara Falls, the township of Stringwater, and the town of Niagara on the Lake. Delimitation surveys were completed at each of these 3 locations, where all oaks, all species, within a 1.6 kilometer radius of the infested trees were inspected for signs and symptoms of oak wilt. So the pest is currently under eradication at all 3 locations, with removal of positive trees, as well as those falling within the root graft zone, completed by March of 2024. We have ongoing annual delimitation surveys, which are completed to monitor the area and verify our eradication efforts. The CFIA will now be looking for 5 consecutive years of negative survey data before we would be declaring eradication for this pest. So I really wanted to include a slide on the importance of partnerships and working cooperatively to undertake a pest response, because really the response would not have gone as smoothly if not for a lot of work that was completed collaboratively with our partners prior to the introduction. So the Oak Wilt Technical Advisory Committee was a pre-established group with the goals of coordinating multi-government information sharing and effectively preparing for the arrival of oak wilt in Canada. So the TAC put a lot of work into advancing the oak wilt file, given its close proximity to the Canadian border, and they worked collaboratively to develop the oak wilt response framework for Canada. So the response framework is published and it's publicly available on CFI's website. The goal of this document was to outline comprehensive measures that could be implemented in the event of an oak wilt incursion in Canada. And this document draws on the experience of a multitude of organizations and partners to form a very robust response plan. This was an invaluable resource used to guide the response back in 2023, and I encourage you to go to the CFI's website and take a look at that if you're interested in having more information. Further, during the response itself, partnerships were again crucial. So from working with municipalities to complete removals and complete ongoing monitoring of high-risk sites, working with provincial and federal partners to support various aspects of the pest response, working with partners such as the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters for assistance with pest reports, as well as ongoing outreach efforts and dissemination of educational materials, the Invasive Species Center for facilitating pest reports and organizing outreach sessions, and also Ontario Parks for coordinating outreach sessions. So this work certainly couldn't have been completed without these partnerships. So aside from preventing new introductions of oak wilt into Canada, our goal is early detection to facilitate a rapid pest response. So while response to a pest incursion, it can be very complex and often takes into account many different factors. Generally speaking, the sooner you're able to find a pest, the greater your chances are to eradicate it. So as the area of the infestation increases, so does the amount of resources required to control or manage the pest long term. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how we're trying to minimize response times through surveillance efforts, the application of regulatory controls, monitoring of pest reports, and raising awareness through outreach and education. So as a complement to the delimitation survey work that we do at the specific locations where oak wilt has been found, we continue to complete annual detection surveys across the broader landscape, and that's done in order to identify new populations of the pest that might be brewing. We focus on high-risk sites, which are most likely to be a pathway of introduction of the pest. So that would include campgrounds, mills and facilities importing oak logs, border crossing with firewood disposal bins, and forested areas in close proximity to known infestations. So the survey takes place between July and mid-August when symptoms are most apparent in the field. And at each site, we look at up to 50 red oak trees for signs and symptoms of oak wilt. And we take samples of suspect material when required, and we submit those to our pathology lab for assessment. So here are a few images that I took during a field trip to Michigan a number of years ago to one of the populations there. During our survey work, samples are often required from symptomatic material that's located pretty high up in the canopy, where the infection, or sorry, where the symptoms are typically located. It's not typical to have access to things like bucket trucks, so that means sampling using pole pruners. So I thought I'd throw this video in for you, showing one of the more impressive feats of forestry that I've seen in my lifetime. For anyone out there who's used those fiberglass pole pruners, I think you'll understand what I mean. It's a very impressive feat. So next you see a photo of a man who at first glance does not appear to know how to properly use the hatchet, but actually what he's doing is using the blunt end of his hatchet to tap down the bole of a tree that he suspects has oak wilt. So when you tap over a pressure pad, you can actually hear a change in the tone of the tapping as you pass over it. This is what some of the folks at the Michigan session called pressure pad hunting. Lastly, we see a bark window that's being taken over top of a bark crack with a suspect pressure pad underneath. So they're very characteristic of oak wilt. And again, I just wanted to reiterate that you won't see those pressure pads or fungal mats and the resulting longitudinal bark cracks on a live tree. So these only will be found on dead trees.
Sorry, Julie, you've got about 3 minutes.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
So this year we didn't have any new detections of oak wilt during our delimitation surveys at the previously positive sites or our detection surveys across Eastern Canada. So that's great news. So in addition to routine surveillance efforts, we also have regulatory tools in place to prevent the introduction of the pest into Canada. So that would include import requirements on regulated articles of oak. So when a regulated pest is present in Canada, we can also place domestic restrictions on specific properties or within an area to prevent the movement of potentially infested materials from leaving the site and further spreading the pest. So CFIA has the responsibility and authority to place these controls, also to carry out survey work on residential properties, and to verify all suspect pest reports under the Plant Protection Act and regulations. So as I mentioned before, the CFIA receives hundreds of pest reports each year. We review and respond to all reports and triage those that require an on-site visit from our inspection staff to collect samples or take a further look. We ask that you please keep the specimen intact and avoid collecting your own samples for this pest that's specific to oak wilt, as it's not an insect that's likely to get away. So we do have inspection staff that can come and take a controlled sample for you. But please report all sightings. Even if you're not 100% sure or you're looking for a second opinion on something, please send it in. Photos are great, as we use these to determine if a site visit or sampling might be warranted. Here are a few examples of some good photos to include. It's great when you are able to include the entire tree, in addition to close-up photos showing the details of any signs and symptoms that you're observing. We do have an oak wilt account set up for direct reports shown at the bottom of this slide. So we know that outreach is one of the key components to early detection and rapid action. So this has been demonstrated over and over again through the identification of new populations as a result of pest reports. So we've seen this with hemlock woolly adelgid, Asian longhorn beetle, EAB, and the finds of oak wilt are no exception to this. So all three of these finds in Ontario can be attributed to pest reports from members of the public or field practitioners who had an awareness of the pest. So training for arborists and other field practitioners is a critical piece to outreach. We work with our partners to provide targeted sessions on oak wilt, whether this be online presentations, hands-on field workshops, or dissemination of educational materials. We're also using our social media platforms to engage the public and ensure awareness on how to identify oak wilt signs and symptoms, awareness of the high-risk period for pest transmission, how to report findings, and where to access resources. So how can you help? Buy and burn your firewood locally. Avoid pruning during that high-risk period. And more simply, look up at the trees. So when you're out in nature, out for a walk in your neighborhood, check out the oak trees and look for signs and symptoms of oak wilt. It's a regulated pest and all sightings need to be reported to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So we ask that you map it, snap it, and tap it and report your observations to us. Our website has places where you can go and report the pest online. There's also a direct link to report on our oak wilt landing page. You can also get involved more formally by completing surveys. And if that's the case, we do want you to reach out to us. We'd love to know if you're surveying for oak wilt. So we have a number of resources as well that are available to you. Our survey protocol is available and hosted on the Invasive Species Center website, which has a number of useful resources, and it has a wealth of information on all aspects of oak wilt, as well as other plant pests. The CFIA site will link you to the pest fact sheets, the oak wilt framework for Canada, and numerous other resources, such as our pest credit cards. And I think I have a fairly well-connected audience here, but I can't underscore enough the importance of outreach and education when it comes to preparedness and response to pest incursions. So the more people who are aware of this pest and others and know how to identify it, the better chances we have in early detection and rapid response. So if after today you have any questions about oak wilt, or for that matter, any other plant pests that CFI surveys for, I'd be happy to chat further and encourage you to reach out to me by email. I'll also pop my email in the chat for you. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Julie. Appreciate that. This is one of the topics that really hits home for me. So really excellent presentation. Really appreciate that. There are 5 questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to those now. So if you do have a chance, Julie, and you want to stop in that Q&A and if you have a chance to answer those, that'd be great. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you so much. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. We're going to move on to the next session. Next session is Spot It, Snap, Catch, and Report It. Prepare to meet the spotted lanternfly. I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Hannah Fraser from the Ontario Ministry of Agricultural, Food and Agribusiness. Hannah Fraser is a provincial horticultural entomologist with the Ontario Ministry of Agricultural, Food and Agribusiness. She works with producers, agricultural associations, governments, and a network of provincial, national, and international researchers and extension specialists to deliver pest management solutions for Ontario growers. Her current focus is preparedness and response planning for invasive and emerging insect pests and agricultural crops, including the spotted lanternfly. Welcome, Hannah. Thank you. Take it away.
Great. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon. There's been some fantastic talks and some ideas that have popped up from other speakers on things that I probably should have included. So I'll try to touch on some of them here today. So welcome, I'm Hannah Fraser. I'm the entomologist for horticulture crops. I've been in this role since 2000. And I found that I've had to deal with a lot of invasive pests during that time. It seems to have been a very important part of my role. And, you know, we don't often have time to prepare for things. Sometimes things catch us by surprise. With spotted lanternfly, this is a pest that we've been hearing about for some time, and this has given us, the collective us, an opportunity to think about it, learn about it, and help and prepare for it. So my goal today is really to introduce you to the spotted lanternfly if you're not aware of it already, learn to recognize it. And of course, this is a pest that we're hoping that you can help spread awareness of. And if you see it, reported. So I'd like to get started with it. So spotted lanternfly is really quite an amazing creature. It's quite a stunning insect. The adults are quite large and very, very showy. They look a lot like a moth or a butterfly, but they're not. They're actually plant hoppers. So plant hoppers, when you think about an aphid is a little tiny insect, has piercing sucking mouth parts, and it sucks plant sap. Well, this is what this plant hopper does, except that it's much larger, and it's often present in very large numbers, and as a result can really overwhelm plants that it's feeding on. This is an insect that is native to parts of China. It was first detected in North America in 2014 in Pennsylvania. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. Now, this is a regulated pest in both Canada and the US, and it's of great concern. We hear about other invasive pests recently, like box tree moth or oak wilt, or pests like emerald ash borer. These are insects or diseases that have a really small host range, but spotted lanternfly actually has a really big host range. It feeds on lots of different things. And there's been well over 100 different hosts that have been identified in North America alone. And these include annuals, perennials, herbaceous, and woody plants. The preference of this insect and what it feeds on varies, of course, by what's available, but also through the season. And part of that is based on the insect growing, what's suitable for it to feed on. Early on, it likes to feed on very tender shoots and things like that. But as the insect matures, tends to move on to woody plants or woody plant parts. And part of that is also because plants are changing through the season. And as we approach fall, plants start to senesce and suitability changes. What we do know about this insect is that it is a plant health stressor. And it's not always a plant killer, it is a plant stressor. It is a significant risk, however, to grapevines. And of course, I deal with horticultural crops, and grape producers across Canada are quite concerned about this insect. Grapes are a preferred host, and there can be really high numbers of spotted lanternfly on grapevines towards the end of the season, especially because as things are senescing in the landscape, these pests seem to end up in grapevines. Their feeding can weaken the vines, and they can actually kill the vines. And it doesn't take that many, and it doesn't take that long to actually have some kind of a plant health effect. So of course, industry is quite worried about this. I wanted to show this slide because this is not really just a plant. When we think about a plant pest, it's also a quality of life pest. When these insects are present in the fall as adults and they're flying around, often in very, very large numbers, they're a real nuisance. They land on people, they land on cars, they land on your house, they land on everything around you. So they're really quite irritating. I find insects really interesting, but not everybody does. The slide in the top right-hand corner is a tree that has been fed on extensively by large numbers of spotted lanternfly. And as you can see under that tree, there's lots of blackened area. What that is that when these insects are feeding, they're excreting a lot of a substance called honeydew. They excrete a lot of, it's almost like rain if you're standing under the tree, and I have done that. What it does is it falls to the ground or whatever's underneath, and it promotes the development of something called sooty mold, and that sooty mold is black. So it's very unattractive. And as you can see, there's not much that's really growing very well under that tree. In addition to that, of course, this is a plant health stressor. It's not just a pest of grapevines. So you can see on the left-hand side, a young black walnut that has been fed upon by this insect, and it's not looking too happy. There's additional costs for managing this pest as well as trying to eradicate it. So really it's a pest that we all need to think about. One of the things with spotted lanternfly is it is a fantastic hitchhiker. And I say that because it moves around in many different ways, and we are very instrumental in helping to move it. So the adults can fly. Now, they're not really strong flyers, but they can move several kilometers in the fall as they're searching around for things to feed on. They're really hungry. I mean, they're trying to build up their reserves, especially the females, because they're going to be laying their eggs. So they're moving around a lot. The real sort of superpower of these insects in terms of being dispersed over longer distances is the egg mass stage. So if you're looking at the picture on the left-hand side, you can see a rusty piece of equipment. And on that, there's an adult, but there are also a few egg masses of the spotted lanternfly. They're about the size of, let's say, a spongy moth egg mass, and they're white when they're initially aged. There's like a putty on top of them, and they're quite visible. But over time, that really ages. It turns brown, and it becomes very difficult to see. It looks like a splotch of mud. So these insects, they will lay their eggs on anything, not just host plant material. They land on things, they lay on things. So they will lay their eggs on like pallets and outdoor equipment and vehicles and all sorts of things. So unfortunately, they tend to get moved around very, very effectively over long distances. One of the things that one of our speakers talked about earlier on today, that was our keynote, Joe Bennett, talked about the challenges of detection. And certainly this is true because those eggs are not always laid in really obvious locations. To give you some perspective on how quickly this insect has been able to spread, I wanted to show you some iNaturalist postings. So this is actually from 2017. So this is 3 years following detection of this insect. You can see that, well, it is spreading definitely from its point of origin in the US. But here we can kind of fast forward to 2025, and you can see this is iNaturalist postings, but they're pretty easy to verify because this is such an easy insect to ID. You can see how far this insect has been spread. Some of it, a local movement, absolutely can be spread by the adults, and sometimes the adults also get moved along transportation lines. But you can see the spread of that, and a lot. And this is despite quarantine and eradication efforts in the U.S. And a lot of that has to do with the movement of egg masses. I'm not going to go into the life cycle of the spotted lanternfly in detail. It is an absolutely fascinating insect, but I did want to point out a few things, and that it really comes back to the egg masses. This insect has 1 generation per year. It overwinters as an egg mass. Okay, so it spends a great deal of its life as an egg. The adults are active in the fall, and they start laying their eggs usually around the fall equinox, so in September, and they will lay their eggs until they're killed by a heavy frost. You can see some of the eggs on, that's actually I believe a silver maple, lots of egg masses there. The egg masses overwinter, and then in the following spring, usually April or May, depending on local conditions, they will hatch out again, and the cycle continues. You can see the immatures there. Those are nymphs, also quite flashy. And the egg masses, again, when they're first laid, they're often that white color, and it changes over time, so it's dark and really hard to detect. The risk period for movement is now until May. So there is a lot of potential for movement of infested materials. I mentioned that this is a regulated pest in Canada. It has been since 2018. There are import requirements that were established fairly early on by the CFIA for incoming deciduous logs with bark, as well as nursery stock coming from the continental US. Now, this recognizing that these are 2 risk pathways, the CFIA looked at what would be required if when this insect is detected in Canada, and they've also they've tried to harmonize requirements. And so domestic requirements would be that nursery stock or logs with deciduous species with bark attached would require phytosanitary documentation prior to movement out of a regulated area. So if spotted lanternfly is in an area, it's very important that it not get moved around. We take efforts to not move it. Although these are 2 named things, really anything should not be moving out of a regulated area that has spotted lanternfly life stages. So it's kind of on all of us to make sure that, that we're not moving this pest around. In terms of the status in Canada, it has not been identified as detected. We don't have established populations that we're aware of, and people are definitely looking for it. Recently, the CFIA has started posting observations on their website. So there's different different observations that they've broken this down into. That's sightings, interceptions, detections, and established population. So a sighting is really somebody, let's say somebody on Facebook posts something and it's a picture. CFIA will follow up, and they've been very good at following up on those posts, and they'll determine whether they're credible or not, and they'll post them, but they don't have a body. They don't have the insect itself. Interceptions are when they find a dead or alive spotted lanternfly on incoming things. Detection would be a live spotted lanternfly in the environment, and established population kind of leads from there. So right now we've had sightings and interceptions, and I do think it's really important that people are posting these things. They are contacting the CFIA. There's some good awareness, and we really need to keep up with that momentum of creating that awareness and making sure things are reported very quickly. We know that this insect has a really sort of a big invasion potential, and it probably is going to do quite well in parts of Canada. If you look on the left-hand side, this is a map developed by the Invasive Species Center, and it's based on some work that was done in published in 2019. And if you look at the dark orange areas, those are areas where spotted lanternfly is thought to probably do quite well, and it sort of so far coincides with what people are seeing and observing on iNaturalist and in research efforts. What concerns me there is when you look around the Great Lakes region, you can see some hot spots in southern Ontario, and unfortunately, those are also the areas where we produce our grapes. And this is not an insect that's going to be limited by hosts. We have a lot of different hosts of spotted lanternfly here in Ontario, including many of its preferred hosts. There's an example here of riverbank grape, and spotted lanternfly love it. They do really well on it, and it's everywhere. The other thing is that the eggs are quite likely to survive our cold winters, so they're not going to be killed off here. There's been some research conducted and recently published by the Natural Resources Canada, just looking at the survival potential. So I think that's really important, and continued research is going to help us inform how we approach this pest. I wanted to mention tree of heaven. This is definitely a preferred host of spotted lanternfly. And of course, when this insect was first observed, people were seeing it on tree of heaven and they thought, oh, it's got to be required for this insect to do well. But that's actually not the case. It does do very well on tree of heaven, but it feeds on lots of things and it moves around. So if it's not finding what it wants, it'll keep moving. Of course, tree of heaven is an invasive species as well, and it's now listed as prohibited under the Ontario Invasive Species Act. One of the things with tree of heaven we hear is, well, can you remove it all? Well, no, that's not practical, but if you can remove it, that's great. One of the things that this group might keep in mind is that it's a really useful tool from a biosurveillance standpoint. So if you're out there and you're looking at tree of heaven and shaking your head, look around, because this is often where spotted lanternfly are first detected when they're introduced to an area. So it's a really great place to look, and we actively seek out tree of heaven when we're surveying for this pest. I mentioned grapevines. They are a preferred host. With repeated prolonged feeding, there can be a tremendous plant health effect on grapevines, including reduced vigor, decreased quality of the grapes that are coming off, and death. And it doesn't take that many individuals to actually have that plant health effect. We're quite concerned because the grape and wine sector is quite valuable in Ontario. It contributes over $5 billion to our economy when you consider production and the taxes, jobs, everything else. So we're quite worried about it. There have been a lot of efforts to try to secure tools to help manage this pest when it arrives, and done so proactively. And of course, we're networking with experts in the States. There is—
Sorry, Hannah, just about 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up. Okay, there is a potential impact on hardwoods. However, it's probably not an issue in the contiguous forest. Mature tree of heaven is preferred, but it also does feed on things like black walnut and maple. And while healthy mature trees in forest are not likely at risk, stress trees probably are. So when you think about urban trees that are in drought conditions, parking lot trees, those cumulative effects can be quite problematic and may warrant some protection. What can you do? Well, look for this pest. If you're traveling in the States, check everything you have. Make sure you're not bringing with you. Make sure to look for those egg masses. They're often hidden. We've heard about not moving firewood, buying it locally and burning it locally. That's a good practice. In terms of preparedness, there is a National Spotted Lanternfly Technical Advisory Committee and working groups. This was established a few years ago, and a lot of that is about that whole collaboration and preparedness, risk mitigation, surveillance. We have an Ontario task force that was formed last year. It is led by OMAFA and CFIA, and we have tried to look at emergency response and what that would look like through some tabletop exercises. And this group also includes industry and many others. And of course, there's surveillance. Nursery industry has been very proactive. They've developed best management practices to help reduce the introduction. It's a lot of biosecurity and prevention control plans. You yourself can educate yourself on spotted lanternfly. There's great information on Pennsylvania State University if you want to ID, like where to look for it and when. We have information online. We talk about this insect all the time. The Invasive Species Center has a training program. It's fantastic. I encourage you to look at it. They're always involved in outreach as well. If you find this pest, well, obviously you want to report it. We've heard about this over and over today for different pests, and this is no exception. So if you find this insect, take a picture, grab the insect if you can, contact the CFIA right away. There's other ways of reporting it. We've heard about the Ontario Invasive Species Awareness Program, as well as EdMaps, but CFIA is probably your best go-to. And with that, if there's any time for questions, I will take some. Otherwise, I would be very happy if you reached out to me by email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That's an amazing presentation for sure. And another emerging pest. Just one question. There are two questions, but one
Sure.
I'll ask. Will lanternfly affect a riverbank grape?
That's a great question. I mean, it's one of these things where they'll feed on lots of things, and they don't necessarily stay on the same thing the whole time. Are they going to have an impact on the population? I don't think anybody has done that work, but it's definitely something that they would gravitate towards if there's not much else in the area, or certainly late in the season, you might find them there. But you do see some early season feeding by the nymphs on things that are like tender shoots of other plants and things like that. So it's a mobile pest. It's really that numbers game and the amount of time that they're actually spending on that plant and other stress that that plant is under. So that really applies to everything, but it applies to riverbank grape as well.
That makes sense. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for the presentation today and for hanging with us. There's one more question in the Q&A. If you have a chance, just pop in there and just answer that. But I really appreciate your presentation today. Thank you, Hannah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to move on to a 10-minute break now. And then we'll come back here at 2:10 for the concurrent session 3 and 4. Thank you.